will now be moving from the intellectual ideas of uh, enlightenment and the intellectual changes of modern Europe. From there, we will be moving into social and political. What are the consequences? So these are all ideas. Remember, my topic started with ideas make society and society make ideas. Till now, we discussed the ideas. Now, because of these ideas, there are changes that are happening in the society, which is what sociology is really interested in. These ideas are creating the changes, which is why we did the ideas. But now I want you to, we will move into what are the changes that came about in the society because the changes in these ideas. So, as a consequence of these intellectual ideas, and once these ideas began to take root and people accepted them, changes have come about in different spheres of the society. It changes came about in the economy, changes came about in the political structure, changes came about in the way they practice religion, changes came about in other spheres of the society. So now we are going into social changes. Earlier we were discussing the intellectual changes and all the intellectual ideas we discussed, scientific and non-scientific. Now we will discuss, because of that, what are the social changes that are happening. First, we will start with the economic social changes. Okay. Now, what is economic, or what is economy? What do we refer to when we say economy? Anybody? I'd like you to just uh, give a shot. What do you think we mean when we say the economy? Anybody? Yeah.
Sir, like change in the structure of economy.
No, no.
Uh,
Yes, that is what we'll discuss. I want you to tell me what is economy. What does economy or economics like? What what does economy mean, or what does economics deal with, or what is the fundamental subject matter of economics? What does economy change in economy? Now, what is economy?
Sir, it is the mm, production and consumption of goods and services in a country.
Okay, you're very very close, and you're almost right. You're almost right. You just missed one word, uh, which is the most important word, which is the crucial word for the whole.
Sir, in turn, it will generate revenue.
No, generation of revenue. Now we are moving into. You mean taxes?
Yes,
No, taxes. We are then moving into state. We are moving into political science then slowly, or at least political economy. But I'm asking, there is production, there is consumption. In between, there is a process.
sir, distribution of resources in an economy.
Yeah. Yeah. Who said that?
Sir, distribution of resources in an economy.
Yes. Correct. That is the crucial step. If I am or me or my family is stranded on an island, or say even a group of families are stranded on a big piece of land, and each of us go and we till the land and we produce and we consume. Subsistence economy. Many tribal societies, even today, they will go. They have very simple farming, simple agriculture. They will produce and they will consume. Is it called an economy? It's not. So, an important step of economy is actually how what is produced, from what is produced to what is consumed, there is in between distribution. And that distribution is the key of economics. How do we distribute those sources? Of course, economics then goes on to say, how do we increase that production? But you cannot increase the production. But usually the answer, how to increase the production, has a lot to do with what you believe should be the principle of distribution. Whatever you believe is the principle of distribution will determine how to increase that production. Okay, they're very closely linked. Now, one way to make that distribution is like in that French society, like I told you, the church and the royalty, the king owns all the land. In those days, there used to be feudal lords. So the king had a few lords, the land, like our zamindars basically. So big stretches of land was given to these lords. And if the king ever had to go to a war, the lords would support him and they would all go to the war. Each lord had in turn a small standing army. Um, the king had to play a strategic game between the lords so that the lords didn't come together and threaten the king. Usually, to do that, he used the church. So he kept the church in good faith that the church would decide. So the church would institute, usually the bishop or the archbishop would say, this is the king, which is where the divine theory of kingship comes. So if a few lords were scheming against the king would then use the other lords and his own army to quash the lords. But basically, it is the lords and the king. These are the royalty. And then you had large lands, and everything that was produced belonged to the lord. The lord, in turn, gave a little bit back to the people who are working, to the agricultural laborers. This is one system of distribution. So, like you said, there is production happening and there is consumption also happening. But how is it getting distributed? Everything is owned by the feudal lord. The produce is owned by the feudal lord, and the feudal lord then in turn gives a little bit to the people who are working on his land. This is a system, and this system of distribution is called feudalism. It's an economic system. It's called feudalism. From here, remember I told you John Locke said right to property. This is the first time when somebody is thinking and writing about this idea of right to property, because your labor is yours, because you've put your body and you've put your mind into making that. Once you say that, this feudal system cannot work, because in feudal system, someone is working and somebody else is appropriating the labor of that work. So somebody is producing, but somebody is appropriating the fruit of that labor. The moment you say you are the owner of your labor, that produce belongs to the person who produced it. In Telugu, most of you are Telugu students, so in some ways, Dunne Vadide Bhumi, it is a right that is recognized, that if you till the land, you can own the produce. I mean, it's a very progressive idea. India is far from it. In India, we still have, unfortunately, mostly it is like a feudal system that exists even today. In Telugu, we called Kavulu, which is sharecroppers, or people go. They are just landless laborers. Most of the Indian farmers that you know, that not that you may know because you are all educated people. So probably you come from decent families, literate families, which means most of the people whom you know must be owning land. But for every farmer who owns a land, there might be 10 who don't own the land. They're all landless laborers. And they don't own the produce. Just like in those days, Europe, today also in India, for the most part, there are landlords who then give away that the produce to back to the landless laborer. Now, anyway, the idea, the other idea is every person owns the fruit of their labor, the produce, and from that produce, that produce can in turn be traded. Okay, so I will bring my produce. I'm a laborer, I'm an agricultural laborer. I'll bring my produce. You are a potter. I will give part of my produce. I'll take a pot. I will give part of my produce to the cobbler. I will buy shoes. I will give part of my produce to the weaver. I'll buy clothes to the baker. I'll buy bread. And similarly, the baker gives me bread, takes grain from me, takes pots from the potter. So there is trading. Trading has always been there, but most of the labor was automatically owned by the state or the church. For the first time, basically the community. Uh, for the first time, we are talking about the individual owning his labor, and that trade, free trade, uh, is the basis for distribution. This is a new form of distribution. Okay, but even before free trade, there was another phase. There was a small phase where they said trading is good, but if everybody comes and trades, there is a problem. So the state will tell, or it will give a certificate, or to few people, it's called a charter, where the state gives a certificate ki you can be a cobbler, you can sell shoes, you can sell pots, you can sell grain. So, and it is under state protectionism that trade happens. This is the first form of trade before it became fully free trade. This form of trade is called mercantilism. And if you remember your East India Company, if you remember, there were charters, Charter Act, so and so, Charter Act, so and so. The reason is the the crown, through a charter, gave the East India Company the right to trade with India, which means only East India Company ships can come and trade the spices and the cotton from India and bring tea from the England. Actually, they were bringing tea from China. So only they were allowed to trade, which is why they're called the Charter Act. So charter is the government or the state giving a decree, a certificate, a license to trade in a particular field. So what you're seeing now is you are seeing the first form of mercantilism, where trading happens, but it is under the protection of the state. But trading is still the basis of distribution, not feudalism. So it is different from feudalism. But from feudalism, before we came to capitalism, the transition stage is mercantilism. Um, then you have the commercial revolution. Because of mercantilism, colonization really took off because it was under the protection of state that a lot of these East India Company, Dutch India Company, all of these companies were floated, and they had the protection of the king or the state behind them. A practice that even today we have. Even today, a merchant vessel has to have the flag of the country that it belongs to. In those days, every merchant ship, every ship on the ocean carried the flag of that respective kingdom. And to attack a ship on the international waters is to attack the territory of that of the flag that it is bearing, of the country that it is bearing. So that ship is a territory of the country that the ship is being protected by. Anyway, so this is mercantilism roughly. Mercantilism is also something that I discussed in your notes that I gave you. In that it says mercantilism in the notes. Last time I shared the notes with you on the group. It says is the economic theory that trade generates. It's an economic theory that trade generates wealth. So there is a belief that by allowing us to trade rather than uh, the state or the church entirely appropriating the produce and then distributing it, a more efficient way to do it is to allow trade. So, is the economic theory that trade generates wealth, and is stimulated by the accumulation of profitable balances. So what happens is, if you allow trade to happen, people will work harder because by trading they can make profits and they can accumulate that profit, and that is a motivation to work harder, and people will work harder, and that is how you will produce more. Remember, then production increases, and the distribution is of that whatever is increased to produce, the distribution is through trade, and that is how it gets distributed, and finally it gets consumed. So you are increasing production because you have changed to distribution from a feudal system to a trade system or a mercantilist system. But the key is, in the mercantilist system, a government should encourage by means of protectionism. So today, the US, the UK, they all speak about free trade, but for the first 150 to 200 years of their own history, of UK's history, of the US history, when they were growing as a capitalist power, they had protectionism. Today, they will ask developing nations not to protect. Okay, this is an important point both for your general studies and your sociology, uh, that the USA and the UK today discourage countries from protecting their borders, protecting their trade. But that is exactly what they did. No, they did not. The UK did not allow Indian fabric, Indian cotton. They only took the raw materials. So basically, the government said this is allowed, this is not allowed. Today, they advocate that there shouldn't be boundaries, there shouldn't be regulations, that you shouldn't control your borders, there should be free trade. But before free trade, for 150 years, they protected trade was protected by their respective governments, by their respective states, and it is under that protectionism that companies flourished. When they flourished and became big enough, they opened the barriers and they started advocating free trade. It was only literally 70, 80 years back that they really started advocating free trade, and they started practicing free trade. Until then, trade was actually protected by the states. That is about mercantilism. It is a consequence of the intellectual changes, and I told you how intellectual changes, whether Locke's right to property, is an important part of appreciating trade or making trade as the basis for distribution and the growth of mercantilism. Then you have commercial revolution. Commercial revolution is a consequence because obviously now we are beginning to say that once mercantilism starts, you are able to accumulate profit, and once you are able to accumulate profit, to be able to accumulate profit, you need to change the way business was done. And this change from earlier guild system or household based making to a more complex system of institutions that were set up to regulate commerce. So there was banking that started coming up. There was joint stock exchanges that came up to create companies. And in companies, so when you have your own business, you own your business and you also manage it. So management and ownership are together. You own your business and you also manage it. But with the company, what happens? The owners don't manage it. So when you buy a stock in Microsoft or Google, you're a part owner. So all the people who own stocks in these companies, they are public listed companies. So many people own it, but nobody manages. There is somebody who is managing it. The CEO of Google or Microsoft are not the owners of Satya Nadella, who is the CEO of Microsoft, is not the owner of Microsoft. In fact, there is no single owner of Microsoft. Microsoft is a public listed company. That change of ownership and management is an important part, and so it increases efficiency again. Because like I told you last time, I gave you the example of how the shipping companies were, because they had huge risks but huge profits. By allowing for public listed companies, they were distributing the profit, but they were also distributing risk. Accountancy, there were advances that were being made in accountancy, how to keep accounts. All of this led to commercial revolution. Commerce began to develop, and until then, the state and the religion decided what was right. Now suddenly people started pursuing profits. Okay, and that shift from feudalism and landlord to trade as the main source of production. Okay, and by they started so all the powerful people in the society started trading rather than owning lands. In fact, they started selling their lands and they started investing in ships or started investing in uh, making markets where they can trade. So there is a movement from feudal or agriculture kind of a setup to trading. That is commercial revolution. Moving away from land and agriculture to trade and commerce. Um, so they moved from a subsistence economy and the subsistence economy that is just so that you produce something so that you can consume and you can live. That's it. You're not attempting to grow, which is why those societies, remember, they were stagnant for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. They remained as they are. They believed in continuity. I told you how the intellectual ideas believed in change. They believed in improvement, which means and a part of that change and improvement is to increase. How do we increase production? How do we increase profits? And this led to a more dynamic market, which is trying to make profits. And that shift is the commercial revolution. Part of that shift is also mobility. The states or the governments of Spain, Portugal, France, Holland, Germany, UK, they started funding their uh, rich people, capitalists. By then, it is not entirely capitalist. They were just they were taking away the money from land. They were selling away that land and putting these, making these companies, trading companies, and they started trading, which is basically the commercial revolution. But that also meant they are moving a lot more. So part of commercial revolution is the change in economy from a stagnant subsistence economy to a more dynamic worldwide economy, which is why when we hear of the word globalization, they say, when you think that globalization is happening today, some people will say, no, globalization started in 1600. That was the first time when people started thinking of a worldwide economy, worldwide market. The shift from subsistence to a worldwide market is the first point of commercial revolution. Then there is mobility of the European merchants. Um, sea routes were discovered. Banking, I just explained to you in the previous class, and how banking had to be set up, and banking then flourished. These are all part of the commercial revolution. Then you have colonization. Yeah. So what happens as a process of the commercial revolution is, uh, because governments are now under protectionism, they protect the trading company, they protect uh, the rich people of their country, and under protectionism, they are now they are funding and they are patronizing and they are sending ships. Now, along with the ships, the scientists and the philosophers and the artists also went to bring back knowledge. So ideas were also developing. In fact, I told you how Columbus himself was part of one of these voyages that went. Sorry, Columbus was there. I'm talking about Charles Darwin, who is a biologist, also went on these voyages. So on these voyages, scientists went, geographers went, artists went, made landscapes, paintings. They made paintings of flora and fauna. They brought back knowledge so that using that, because remember, the faith is that using knowledge, you can manipulate and you can, and all of this knowledge was actually used in controlling those people. Now, uh, by funding these people and by sending their own armies on these ships. Remember, I said mercantilism is protectionism. By sending their own armies on these ships, one, to attack pirates in case the pirate tried to break the ship, but also because once the ship landed on the shore, if there was resistance, these forces were then used to overcome that kind of a resistance. Of course, For places like India, it is difficult because India is already an existing civilization. So there they came and they started trading rather than directly attacking. But for the Americas, when they went to the South America, the North America, they just went with the army, and those were very small tribes. There was not huge. Um, the existing civilizations were very primitive. So these people with their gunpowders and guns and horses and ships, they could very easily overtake. But more than all that, actually, what they carried were germs. The Europe was a very it had black plague in the 10th and 11th century due to the Dark Ages. They had the bubonic plague, and they developed resistance against these bacteria, exactly like vaccination today. We are vaccinated so that we develop resistance against coronavirus. These people, half of Europe was wiped out in those plagues, but eventually the coming generations had a resistance, inbuilt immunity to these plagues, but their body had those germs and that bacteria and virus on them. So when they used to land on the shores of these virgin lands, the Americas, those native population never had these bacteria. So even before they would go and attack and do war, this germs could spread. And the first time they settled, because see, no village, the moment a newcomer comes, they're not going to attack and kill him or something. They're initially going to try to talk and see. Nobody wants to get into violence unnecessarily. And those are not big civilizations like us. For example, for in our Malabar coast, in Kerala coast, the Travancore king is a very powerful king, very large armies. The on the eastern coast, the Tanjavur, the Vijayanagara Empire, or the Chola dynasty, to which the Tanjavur belongs. Chola dynasty, the navy is a powerful navy during the 10th century AD. In fact, they went and they occupied. We were ourselves colonizers. We went and occupied the Southeast Asia and a large part of actually Southeast Asia, which even today has huge Tamil influence there. So we were kingdoms of our own right. It was not. It couldn't have been possible. Yes, they had gunpowder and the guns, the technology of guns, but that was not so much. I mean, you can't just come and take over. So with us, they started with trading, negotiating on these terms, but when on the western side for the Americas, they just went and they took over, and populations were wiped out very easily. Mm. Anyway, so I will go into the detail of colonization uh, after a break. Yeah, colonization. Okay. Now, colonization, like the term indicates, the Zation is a process, but process for what? Okay. The process of one society controlling the political power or the territory of another society, so that the resources, so that they have control over the economic resources of that territory. That is colonization. I will repeat it. Colonization is I'm giving it in simple terms. Once I give you the technical, once you understand the simple terms, once you get it intuitively, once you really understand it in the mind, when you remembering the definition is not going to be hard. Colonization is a process of taking control of another territory for economic resources. It is important because colonization is a rather new phenomenon, modern phenomenon. Before that, also wars were fought, and certain kingdoms or certain societies had power over others. For example, the Romans had power over Egypt. For example, Alexander from Greek came all the way to India, and everything in between he controlled. But that is not colonization, or that is not colonialism. Also, one more clarification. When there is a suffix ism, I told you that it is usually a belief or an attitude or philosophy or an ideology. It can also be a system. Okay, that's the only additional thing that I want you to register and add it to your memory, which is ism means usually belief, ideology, and all of that I told you till now, plus system. Okay, now going back to there have always been kingdoms that were going and taking control over other territories. We did, like I just said, the Cholas went and controlled the East Asia, Southeast Asia. Um, the Europeans controlled Central Asia. This was there. But the thing is, that is not colonialism. Instead, it was imperialism. Now, this is another word. Again, these are all part of your GS syllabus. Literally, the terms colonialism and imperialism are also part of your GS syllabus. Um, and you need to make a distinction between the two. Imperialism is when a society thinks that its culture, its values, its ideas is the highest, it's the best, and they need to be spread to other territories so that they can also enjoy the progress or the benefits of this culture. And so it is done in a spirit of my culture is the best, and therefore everybody has to follow this. It is not done for economic reasons, it is done for cultural reasons. That is imperialism. So when the Cholas went, they went believing that the Chola architecture, art, ideas, philosophies, religion, all of this is the best. And they're trying to spread that. They are not trying to go loot and bring money from there or bring resources from there. That is not the idea. In imperialism, that is not the idea. When Alexander conquers half the world and comes all the way to India from Europe, you know, across the Silk Route, across the land Silk Route, he is not doing it imagining that he can take resources from India or he can take resources from Central Asia. That's not the idea. The idea is so that he can take civilization, what he believes to be the highest form of civilization. So he believes he can take that and enlighten other kingdoms and other less civilized people of uh, his ideas, their culture. So imperialism is cultural in nature. As opposed to that, colonialism is more economic in nature. So I hope you are getting the distinction between imperialism and colonialism. Imperialism is more cultural in nature. Colonialism is more economic in nature. Colonialism doesn't care much about whether you're propagating your culture, your ideas, and all. In fact, for a long time, the policy of the British was non-interference. Contrary to the later textbooks, later history was written in a way as though the British really cared about the Indian society and wanted to reform it, and all reforms came because of colonialism. It is actually not the case. For, for the initial 70 to 100 years, the British did not want to reform the country. They did not want to interfere in those practices. They wanted to trade. They wanted to get as much as possible, take it, sell it, trade. That's it. It was commercial interests, economic interests, not cultural or political. That is the fundamental difference between. So in colonialism, there's a lot more exploitation. And in colonialism, the power is taken only so that they can get resources. Okay. Now, eventually, there will also be slight cultural changes. They needed those cultural changes because it was becoming impossible to. Do you even know how much UK is? UK as an entire country is smaller than one of our small states. And they are at least more than 4,000, 3,000 kilometers apart. And from there, coming soldiers coming by ships and controlling a territory. And that time, India, you have to understand, is almost from Afghanistan to the end of Bangladesh, Myanmar. That is India. Our length and breadth itself is 3,000 kilometers. Length, though, okay, it's 2,000, less than 2,500, but your breadth is more than 3,000 kilometers. Huge territory. How does the British even imagine they're going to? So then they needed local people who can help them administer. And for that, then they transferred a certain amount of cultural changes that happened. But that was all later. And also by then the media started coming. There was pressure inside their own society that colonialism is getting too exploitative, too discriminatory. and they needed to justify some of these things, and they started doing it by saying, oh, these are barbaric things, these are horrible civilizations, we are going, and they call what is called a white man's burden. They said it is upon us to civilize the world. So although we use all these in history, this history was written much later. This was not what was happening initially. This history was written to justify colonialism, but colonialism itself was a process of economic control of resources of another territory by one society. No. And going back to our topic, which is mercantilism. In mercantilism, the state is supporting traders to go and trade with other territories, and they are providing their own army. In doing all of this, colonization happened. There are two kinds of colonization. There is settled colonization and non-settled colonization. Settled colonization is like South Africa, actually not so much South Africa, also mostly America, where they have, or Australia, where they have entirely exterminated the local population. The Native Americans are gone, the Red Indians are gone, or in the Australia, the native tribes of Australia are gone. These people go, they settle, they create the new society. Same is the case with Latin America, entire South America and North America. That's the case. Australia also, that's the case. That is settled colonialism. As opposed to that, the non-settled colonialism is like India and Philippines, Indonesia. This is where they come, but they don't. They come, but they are separate from the existing society, because these are existing civilizations already. So you can't just come and take over their land like that. There are existing people, histories that run into thousands of years, and again, it's a civilization. It's not just a small tribe that you can come and take over. So it wasn't that easy when it comes to them. Now, anyway, so all of this is part of the commercial revolution. That colonization is also part of the commercial revolution and part of the economic changes that were happening in Europe. Banking, I told you in the last class that you needed an independent arbitrator. So suddenly, you needed banking also because till now, exchange of goods was more in kind. That I will give you this much grain, you give me a pot. I will give you this much grain, you give me bread. I'll give you this much grain, you give me shoes or clothes. It's so much more in kind. And for that, you don't need too much money. You don't need too much currency in the system to circulate, in the society to circulate. You can do it. So trade is happening more almost like barter. It's happening in trade. There was cash, but you don't really need, because like I said, mostly they were subsistent economies. They were stagnant economies. As opposed to that, once you have the commercial revolution and everybody is they're keeping accounts and they're trying to increase the profits on the balance sheet. Once that shift happens, you need another entity that is financing. Okay, that is keeping accounts, that is checking whether a particular company is solvent or not. Somebody has to tell whether investing in this firm is good or not, because public is coming and now investing in these shipping companies, in these trading companies. But so who is going to certify that this is a better company than this? So then banks come into picture. So the first form of banks were actually not saving banks as we know them now, or not even, they were to a degree they were lending banks, but lending into what? They were lending for ventures, they were lending for businesses. And how did they decide which business is good and which business is not? So, which is why the first form of banking was actually investment banking. Okay, which is even today the highest paid banking service. The banking that we do, where we go, we saving account or something else. This is lending, buying loans, and all this. This is nothing. The real banking is investment banking, where banks decide to invest in big corporations, or banks decide where their clients must invest. These are called investment bankers. They have high net worth individuals. They have huge clients who then. Now, all of this has roots there, where in banking, you needed a system to ascertain the solvency. The solvency is how financially sound is a particular company, a trading company or a shipping company. And in order to do that, you needed banks. Also, these big shipping companies needed big capital. Where do you get that kind of a money from? You get it because banks are there, small banks are there, people invest in them. They use that money in turn to invest to lend to this big trading and shipping companies. So that is the system why banking became popular and it immediately grew. Of course, in the initial part, each bank had its own currency. The initial 100 years or so, eventually there was common currency. The central banks came into picture. In India, it is the RBI. At that time, RBI was not there. The UK had the Imperial Bank that came into picture. The America had its own federal bank. These are all central banks. They made a common currency, and other banks had to then accept it because it was made by the state. So the central banks came into picture. But before that, each banks had their own currency. Again, these are all just trivia that I'm giving you so that you appreciate the story. Don't go and write these things in your answer. Don't waste space. It's enough to say that banking as a system was an economic change. It was part of the commercial revolution. It was part of the social changes that were happening. Similarly, joint stock companies. I told you this. I explained this in detail the last time. All of these changes, eventually, when they started taking root and they started changing the society, you started moving from feudalism through mercantilism, through commercial revolution to finally capitalism. Okay, where by now because of this trade that happened, protected trade that happened, enough profits have accrued to the trading companies and to these governments. So Italy, Spain, Portugal, they became some of the richest countries in the world. France became one of the richest countries in the world. UK became amazingly rich. UK was an empire in itself, the Great British Empire, an empire where the sun never set because its colonies were so far and wide that at any point of time the sun was there. So it became such a large empire, and all of that wealth started pouring into Europe. Enough so that they now, as a society, moved to capitalism full fledged. The thing about capitalism is protection of the state is no more required. In fact, to the contrary, the state is asked to go back and not interfere in trade. Remember, the earlier part, we were telling about separation of state from the church. We said the secular state is like, we don't want church to interfere in matters of the state. By capitalism, you have what is called a free market economy from a protected economy of mercantilism. From the protected economy of a mercantilism, from a protected market, you move to a free trade and a free market economy where you say the state should not interfere in market. The market is best if it is entirely free. Again, another model of distribution. So production and consumption will even more increase. Our happiness will even, it is believed that production and consumption is the source of our happiness. Our needs, our wants are all material. And it will even more increase production and consumption if the distribution is entirely left open. State should only ensure that people are not playing unfairly. Now, that is the only role of the state. So let the state go back, or in fact, the slogan that they gave, that capitalism gave from Adam Smith, the first founder of capitalism, or the first thinker of capitalism, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, a brilliant book that he has written, he argues that it is in the nation's interest to let the market free. Let the market free. Yeah. So that these are roughly the economic changes that were happening in modern Europe.